Welcome to the Best Of series, where we're celebrating the most inspiring moments and powerful insights from our recent episodes. Whether you're new to the podcast or a longtime listener, these highlights capture the heart of our conversations, bringing you wisdom, guidance, and a fresh perspective on the journey of growth, love, and healing. Join us as we revisit these transformative discussions and discover the gems that have resonated the most with our listeners and with me. Let's dive in and explore what makes these moments truly unforgettable. Yeah, so where do we begin? Where did your journey towards who you are now really where did it all begin?
I think literally began in the womb. My mother had a broken back. And before I was born.
We share that, by the way.
Really?
Yeah,
I did not know that.
Yeah.
Was your mother, did she have a broken back while she carried you?
And she had severe injury during birth. Yeah.
Wow. I did not know that.
Yeah.
And so I've had a lot of recurring issues, like things that stop me when I try to go expand in my life. And it all comes back to this part or story or belief or experience that my purpose in life will hurt somebody because there's a sort of perinatal experience of being in this womb and having an awareness of the pain that my mother was in. And I've had a lot of conversations with different people about this, Frank Anderson being one of them. And he always pauses me and he says, Mastin, you didn't cause her pain. She experienced pain, but that's not because of you. And then what else can you tap into? And I asked my mom this question and she said, there was so much love I was holding you with. I think there's this pain orientation sometimes, but I think that's probably the beginning of it, this conflictual experience of my presence causes pain. Probably, which was literally true at the time, though not my fault. And I think that that's been this through line throughout my life. And I pair that with my father being a PhD in biology, editing a peer-reviewed journal, raising me in academia, attending his lectures and stuff like that, and then completely rebelling against that. And I was reflected recently, my dear friend Tucker Mack said, Mastin, you took the hardest path possible to get where you are. You could just go to school for 4 to 6 years and been fine, but you took the hardest path possible. And I was like, that's true, Tucker. I did take the hardest path possible. But it starts to make sense why when you start to see kind of how things get set up. And we all know how much gets set up in the womb the first 3 months after birth. So I think a lot of that stuff got set up for me there. And so I have this very strange sort of conflictual holding of wanting scientific rigor, rejecting academia, wanting to help, and parts holding that when I help, I hurt. So that's a lot of conflictual things that I navigate even to this day. And so that's, I think, why I probably took the hardest way possible.
That's a lot of binds that are kind of like pulling simultaneously in opposite directions.
Yes.
I'll pause for a moment to say, I think it might be so familiar for you and I to be like, of course, things that happen in the womb have an effect, but I don't know if that's so familiar for most folks, like, or part of their understanding of our developmental process. And I think it might be worth us even diving in a little bit to say, like, wait, how could we possibly, what affected us or the ecosystem that we were gestating in possibly have an effect on us?
Yeah. If I know the research, I will cite it. And sometimes I know the research, but I forget the citation. So
no worries. We're not here in an academic journal.
Just try my best.
I forget shit all the time too, my friend.
But there's a whole field of perinatal psychology. And if you just sort of think about it intuitively, your mother is your first attachment, literally. And she has certain experiences, thoughts, feelings, physical sensations. She's observing the environment. And there's a programming that happens where her physiology literally is your physiology, and the baby is born having an awareness of the environment it's being born into, sort of through a programming process. And I had a breathwork experience about 1.5 years ago where I use this word lightly. It wasn't regressive in a negative context. It was just returning to a prior state in a positive context. So maybe it was a reprocessing would be a better word. But I remember the felt sense of that transmission happening in the womb. It was a very interesting breathwork experience. And based on the orientation of my mother's, broken back, the love she had for me, all these different things, I had a certain expectation of the world that was projected onto the entire universe about certain things that I had no awareness of. It's kind of like, this is how life is, basically. And that prepares you for the environment you're about to be born into, which from a biological perspective makes a lot of sense. And then if you look at the work of Dr. Beatrice Beebe and like her micro noticings of like these like 1/100th of a second, subcortical co-regulation of mother and child and like their facial expressions and attunement. I mean, and also Dr. Ed Tronick, you look at the work of these two, and so much gets set up in the first 3 months in terms of facial expression of the mother, proximity to attunement for the caregiver, whether it's the mother or the father, whoever the primary caregiver is, like, is your environment safe or not? And the first 3 months is predictive of the first year in terms of where you'll start being wired in terms of all of your different expectations of life in the universe and resource availability, emotional availability, safety, all that type of stuff, which then sets up the first 3 years. But those first 3 months, I think it was Dr. Tronick, I can't remember, who basically said, if you get the first 3 months, or maybe it's Bruce Perry, I can't remember, it's one of the two, where if you get the first 3 months right, like so many other things can go wrong and you can have an incredible developmental trajectory. And if you don't get the first 3 months right, meaning attunement, proximity, et cetera, then you can do a lot of good things after that and have potentially more negative outcomes, which is not a sign to have a child for 3 months and then abandon them, by the way. But it just means that those first 3 months are so very powerful and critical for like the development of a child, because you're basically learning how this universe works. You're learning the rules at a very like early developmental level, somatic level. There's no prefrontal cortex really when you're that young. So it's all getting programmed into the viscera, into the brain stem, and all this type of stuff about here's the rules. Yeah. And it's amazing how much regulation can come from, or dysregulation can come from, facial expressions of the mother. And so when I first saw that work from Dr. Beebe, I was like, oh my gosh, this makes so much sense. That's why still face triggers me so much. Like, smile or get mad, but don't be blank. Apparently that's the worst thing you do to a kid is still face. So the combination of the information that's being input into the baby or into you when you're in womb, plus those first 3 months, basically sort of forms this expectation of this world that you're being birthed into. And then it becomes, the way I think of it, as a filter through how you experience everything else. And it's almost like the first 25 years of life, this time that kind of like can wound us, injure us, propel us. And then the second part of life is about figuring out the first part of life, because now we have a prefrontal cortex to figure it out,
That's an interesting way to see it. And yeah, I can see that in terms of like, well, that's, certainly when most people go into more therapy, there's more like witness online to then reflect back. The first 3 months, that's a very sensitive period. And during even, 6 months in utero is when that our body memory, our implicit memory starts to really form. And so we're actually recording information on a non-cognitive level that really sets the foundations.
Exactly.
And we all know, if we walk into a party and everyone's like gossiping, it's kind of like a toxic environment. And, even if we don't know what's going on, we can feel it. And that sort of implicit memory, that visceral experience, like you were talking about, starts in utero, which is wild.
Wild. Yeah, it's a big deal.
Big deal. And we don't develop the explicit memory, that sort of tracking of time and narration of specific beginning, middle, ends until like 2-3 years old. And so we have several years, which includes in the womb, of just like sponging up all of these like vibes, so to speak.
Yes.
And experiences that don't have a beginning, middle, end, don't have a timestamp, don't have narrative understanding. And it's pretty significant and affects us even as adults. All that shit we sucked up like a straw.
Yeah, exactly. I constantly amazed that as I do this work, because I'm sure like you, like always in it, like I'm this is the work that I do. I'm also a member, I have trauma a different way. And it's just amazing how the layers get peeled back. You're like, that's not actually how all of life is. That's just your experience in that moment, but it becomes this universal experience of the way life is. Like, it's almost like this is the laws of physics. And you're like, wait, the laws of physics aren't that? Well, hold on a second. Wait a minute. What? Holy cow. So I feel like I'm constantly amazed at how that redecision can happen over time because of this nice handy dandy device, the prefrontal cortex,
The more you are known, the more you become a screen for projection. And it's an interesting process. And
it challenges you as a person.
It does challenge you as a person. And it offers the possibility of gently turning that projection screen into a mirror.
100%. I look at every single fucking thing that happens, every comment that I get that's negative or positive for that matter, as exploration, as a, like, I don't think anything happens to me. I think it happens for me.
Yeah.
So like when I had my cease and desist, when I've had, you know, I the other day we lost an investment. I lost $60,000 in one night of an investment that I saved up for years to make, and it was gone overnight. And it's one of those moments that, like, sure, I could sit here and say how unfair. And I was like, okay, let's be solution driven. What do I have control over? Well, not that, right?
Yeah.
Like, that's gone.
Yeah.
So, okay, let's make adjustments elsewhere. I see every area of opportunity of what is this trying to tell me about myself? And I think that is a really, to me, strong way to be when you're, especially when you're dating and you're looking at this, because it's so easy to stay single and feel healed.
Yeah.
Right? I'm not triggered.
I have a secure earned attachment.
Yay! And then
alone.
Exactly. Then you meet somebody and this person doesn't call you back or doesn't ask you on that date or doesn't reciprocate in the way that you wanted, and it's hell in a handbasket. Yeah. So I really look at all of these opportunities to really try to look at, like, well, wait a minute, where did I learn this from?
Yeah.
I didn't just learn this out of nowhere.
Yeah. We internalize so much that we're not aware of. Whether it's what our environment was like. It doesn't even have to be like, we could have great parents who are loving and be in an ecosystem of chaos and internalize that as our homeostasis.
100%.
And going back for a second, you know, when my therapist gave me the certificate that of earned secure attachment, which I have on my wall, and
I want one.
and then getting into a relationship, I was like, wait, where did that go? And I think this is a really important thing to address, because we can do deep work in individual therapy. We can do deep work on our own, but there's another layer of deep work that can only happen in relational dynamics.
100%. The guy I met before Ryan, it was at the same time.
Yeah.
And it always happens that way. At the same time. Because Mama was an avid dater. She wasn't passive by any means. Like, I was out there. Even after Clem died, I was like, your life goes on. Like, you've got to keep going. Clem was my best friend. He was my dog. I had him for 10 years. He got me through everything. And that was my object permanence. That's why it meant so much to me. He was the only security I had. So when I lost that, I was like, you're fucked. Like, when you lose everything that you love, and I wasn't talking to my dad at the time, you're like, what else do I have to lose? Yeah. But once I started to, like, I remember the guy that I, like, when I first met Ryan and this other guy, or at the same time, and, like, we were both honest with each other, like, hey, I'm still dating other people. Like, we're, you know, kind of still seeing things out. The other guy was struggling with a lot of mental health issues. And I saw myself, and he was, like, very attractive. On paper was all the, like, I want that. Yeah. And then love Ryan, he just wasn't as out, where he wasn't as expressive. So I was like, oh, we don't really banter. We don't really laugh. Like, he's a little more closed off. So off the bat, I was like not giving him as fair of a shot. But this other, because I thought I was so healed. You know, I was like, I am this healed legend, and I can go in and I can save this person, where I can be there for him. Yeah. And I'll never forget when he, like, we had a conversation, and he was like, I'm battling a deep depression. And my mom looked at me and she held my hand and she said, Sabrina, I think you need to understand that this might be above your pay grade. And she was right. She was right. This guy, we talked like a few months ago. He messaged me being like, I'm so happy to see, like, your growth and everything. But he was like, I was nowhere near ready to even entertain you. Yeah. And I think what we look at is, like, you think you're so this, oh, I can do this. And then when I met Ryan, he was so solid. And I was like, oh God, am I going to be this, like, hot mess of aversion? I'm the one that's anxious. And it was like, no. We both grew. We both learned each other. We both evolved, and we both helped each other. I had such a negative connotation. I always thought a woman changed, like, oh, I can be the woman that changes him. Like in the movies of, oh, it's the bad boy, and she gets Matthew McConaughey and she convinces him to be with her. No, that's not how that works. What it ended up being was being the person that you are, being a safe space, communicating clearly, being open and receptive, being vulnerable first and saying, hey, can I share this with you? And then creating a safe space so that person can say, wow, oh, okay, let me share. That is how we changed each other.
What is one of those emotion things you talk so much about in your new book? Like, those human people have, and, like, wear them down, and they avoid, and they doing all the things with those things, or not doing all those things with those things called emotions.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think as organisms, we are somehow wired to want to avoid pain. Unfortunately, our parents or caregivers, even with the most love in their heart, they said, shh, you're okay. Or they said, there's nothing to be afraid of. Or they said, stop crying. Or worst case scenario, I'll give you something to cry about. And so we learned, because we knew as tiny little animals that we needed their closeness to survive. And so if we cried a lot, or if we expressed ourselves sensitively or dramatically, and they went further away or became angry with us, we were invested at a survival level to do anything we could to not be that way. And to not express that feeling. And so all of us learned, whether it's because they gave us a lollipop or put us in front of a screen. And then, of course, our economy and culture is literally funded by us wanting to consume and distract our way away from our humanity. All of us learned or basically unlearned how to let this organic homeostasis maintaining system, the emotional system, is one of the body's brilliant systems to keep us present, to move things when we need to. And so most of us got in the way of that. And by the time someone might pick up a self-help book or be listening to the Gently Used Human podcast, people have usually decades of unprocessed emotional pain that they can barely feel, but it's wreaking havoc on their lives because there's no way to be in your body in a peaceful way if you're not willing to have the human emotions that come with your body. So that's where I'll start.
Yeah, I love that. I think it's so interesting because I remember as a young 20-something-year-old, like having this point in my life where I was like, I don't actually know what an emotion is. Like I have a cognitive idea, but I'm not sure on a feeling level. I've had like these cathartic experiences that were like emotional waterfalls. But I'm not sure like I've ever like had it situated in myself that I could feel it. And it was such a mystery to me.
I get that. I think most people are in that situation. And by the way, I am not implying anyone. I think almost no one got emotionally potty trained when they were little. But so I don't think I think the sad truth is that you and I were the norm.
Yeah.
And there's so many, whether it was because of the conditioning or just because it didn't seem cool to feel.
Yeah.
Or it can be overwhelming. To go back to the first thing I said, we're animals that somehow want to avoid pain.
Yeah.
But it's just like the problem is the efforts to avoid emotional pain cause great amounts of emotional pain.
Yeah.
And other pain, like relational pain, addictive, like health problems. It's like there's no way. It's just so much easier once you realize, oh, it's like taking a poop. It's not a big deal. And once you clear out that backlog, once you catch up with yourself, it's just, and it's like, for me, I think the skill of knowing how to do it creates a sense of I can do anything. I can be who I really am. I can go big, take risks, fall in love, get my heart broken because I know how to shit it out.
I think there's been such a focus on trauma and healing trauma. And we sort of have like taken this weird turn away from like refilling our crayon box of emotions to be coloring and expressing ourselves in the world. And
it's so true. And I actually barely use the word trauma. There's a lot of caution in the trauma healing field. But I don't even really, and I do use the word trauma in certain places, but I really like to talk about the thing we're doing as an emotional wound, which is, of course, what trauma means. But just to get away from the buzzwords and just to, because we kind of know what it's like when you have an injury or a wound.
Yeah.
People generally don't feel as ashamed about that. Whereas if they had a very traumatic childhood, they might feel ashamed of or if they're traumatized, PTSD, there's both hype and stigma, I think, around certain words, and I try to avoid them. And it's hard to be a human and not be gently used, as you point out in your title.
It is hard to be a human, and it is hard to feel our feels. And I think there's there's a value to that too. I mean, as you said, it's like, especially if we grew up with like caregivers or community that was shushing us or not supporting us. It's not just that the emotion didn't get to be moved, but there's kind of a wounding and the abandonment of being present with it.
Yeah, the abandonment first from those people around us, and then the self-abandonment. Because and everyone does this. No one has to feel bad about it. But I think for me, the most illuminating point that I learned in grad school and that I've seen throughout, that's in my book, around why does everyone feel like they're not enough? Why is everyone literally walking through the world with some kind of, am I an imposter? Am I lovable? Am I good enough? I really see this as a pervasive problem. And so there's a very obvious thing to me around why. And it's like, when were those tiny little babies completely dependent? You know, we had two options basically of how to interpret any kind of neglect or emotional miss. And one was to feel like, I'm innocent. I'm just a little cute baby. And the people who are trying to take care of me are causing me pain, which boils down to me good, world unsafe.
Yeah.
The alternative, so feel that, anyone listening, like me, I'm innocent, but I'm dependent on an unsafe world, which is true also. But the alternative was, I'm bad, but if I do better, if I act more like daddy wants me to act, or if I clean up my room, or if I get better grades, or if I act like the other kids, then maybe I'll get the love I need and I'll survive. And so that's just like a little more empowered. There's a diluted sense of agency and control, which makes little vulnerable sacks of cells feel better. And so all of us, it was the most adaptive thing to feel like it was our fault.
Yeah.
And because we were so sure that there was a life-threatening problem if these parts were expressed, all of us push them down and repress them in some way into what I like to call the emotional basement closet.
Mm-hmm.
And so we end up moving into phases of life like middle school or high school with like the most sensitive, unique, awesome, but like weird, awkward, parts of us tucked away, because no one's tucking away their athletic capacity. No one's tucking away their intelligence, because they were probably getting praised for that. The parts that we push away are our sensitivity, the part of us that cries, the part of us that needs. And so, these are our compasses in a way. These are the ways we feel what's right for me.
Mm-hmm.
What gender do I actually feel lit up by? What form of intelligence do I actually have? And so by the time you're a teenager, a young adult, most people feel that's where the imposter shame and really like the deep wound that we are maintaining by caging these parts of ourselves. So just one thing about emotional potty training in my book is that before we can learn to re-grease the system, the emotional system, we have to find and court, remember, reintegrate the parts of us that are wounded.
Well, the point of the work that Gendlin did, and he had done research into successful psychotherapy.
Yeah.
What they found was that clients who were going to be successful in their therapy tended to do something different in the very first session.
What was
and
it?
That was that they paused and became aware of something they were feeling that wasn't clear, that wasn't easy to put into words. And clients who could just articulately speak about their problems and their emotions and their families, blah, 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 those weren't the ones that tended to do well in therapy. But people who could at some point, I don't know how to say this. Gosh, that pointed to success in therapy.
Wow.
So the dimension below the ways we always think, the ways we've interpreted our life, the stories we've told ourselves, the dimension below that is at first unclear. And so to be able to tolerate, I don't know what I'm feeling right now, but I do feel it right here in my chest. To be able to tolerate the I don't know yet and then stay with it a while is something that's very valuable to learn.
Yeah. I think my deepest experiences in any type of therapy sessions were those moments where, that's so frustrating as a client when you hear the therapist go, and can we pause here and be with what is
pause and
here?
Be with this vague, unclear,
and you're just like, no, I want to tell the story. I want to,
right?
I want to rage. I want to like say they did it, or and it's like, or blame myself, or do any of these techniques to sort of avoid sitting in the unknown potential for meaning.
That's right.
Because with that is going to come a slew of images or feelings and sensations that we don't necessarily have like this control over that we would like. and they're just going to have to ride through us.
And we need fresh metaphors to describe them, like the prickliness you were describing a moment ago, or the slope. With the fresh metaphors, I don't have a word for this. I'm going to have to invent new language, images, metaphors to say what it feels like right now. But in what it feels like, all these new, fresh possibilities emerge. Life isn't meant to be stuck. We're not meant to be going over and over the same ideas, the same addictions, the same problems, falling into the same kind of stuck relationships. That's not what life is for.
Yeah.
It's meant for new possibilities, for growth, for next steps to come.
Yeah.
But the place where the next steps come from is this at first very vague and unclear, and somewhere in the body I feel like something. Speaking of language, I want to mention my favorite word.
Yeah.
The word that I believe is the most facilitative word in any language, because I've taught around the world. It's the word something.
Something's here.
Something is here. I'm feeling something. I can't describe it yet.
I love that word too, especially when you're like in reflecting back to someone, like something's really here for you. And it's just
beautiful.
such a you see them just melt of as though you said the exact thing that's there, but something is such a vague word.
It's deliberately vague. It's the ultimate in vagueness.
Yes.
And for that reason, it holds an accepting space for anything to come.
It's vague and inclusive.
Yeah.
I love that. Wow. I really, again, I appreciate so much your ways of helping people not only be in dialogue in a way that just feels more in relation. Because I think, when you're doing couples work or when you have a patient come in or a client come in, the thing that I hear the most, and it's not what I hear, it's what I feel and see. It's in the need for connection and the arguments that happen, there is disconnection.
Yeah.
And so the art of staying with oneself, with another person, and still be in relationship, the radicalness that I could be angry and love someone simultaneously.
We all know that way.
We all know
that place, don't we?
And to see the difference between I can either be angry or in love with you. And it doesn't establish that place, a bridge that we actually are seeking through the argument or seeking in our greatest primal intention.
You're right. There is an art to being able to have and feel myself at the same time. I'm creating a clear pool for you.
Yeah.
And when I first tried to learn to do this, I felt like somebody had asked me to pat my head and rub my stomach at the same time. I don't know how to do both these things. I could do this one or that one, but how do I do both?
Yeah.
But it's possible.
Yeah.
And now I've got it. I'm talking to you. I'm interested in what you're saying. And I'm also aware, how am I right now? And it's something we really need when we're in relationships that matter to us, whether they're collegial or therapeutic or friendly or romantic. We need to have ourselves at the same time having an openness to sensing how it is for the other.
Oof. It is. I think it's a really just to normalize. It's an unfamiliar process for most to be able to be with themselves as fully as they can and be with another person. It for many of us, it feels like a tug of war. It just feels
absolutely
like such an battle.
I remember when it was impossible. When being with another person, especially a romantic object, I was just empty. There was no me. I wanted to kind of disappear into that other person. Or I didn't even want to. I just did. So it was a long road from that to start realizing, no, I want to be aware of myself. I don't want to disappear. And if you've been in relationships like that from either side, no, everybody loses, because you really want a relationship where two fully aware people are coming together.
Yeah.
what's not going well becomes toxic positivity. And it's true on the flip side. If you're stuck in a negative thought loop, that's just as bullshitty as when you're stuck in a positive thought loop. So can we equalize the forces and find a balance of what's good and what's working and what's not? You're going to feel, and I see people do it. They do this. You mean I don't have to be happy all the time? I don't have to be grateful all the time? It's such a relief because that's just not how human. That is just not a realistic goal for the human condition.
No, not at all. I mean, I can think of so many times where it's like, I don't know about you, but like I've been in a hard situation and someone's like, well, what did you learn from it? And it's like, well, I'm not even, it's actually can be a beautiful question after some time, but it's like, the question could be, how can I be with you in this? How can I support you in this? Like, that's kind of the question, I would imagine. What do you think? What's one way of like, you see a friend, a lover, someone outside of you who's really in that stuck? Like, what's something you could say or do that just supports them in this process of the little yeses or being with the truth and themselves in their core?
I'll answer that question, but I also think that's a tricky one because it's like, well, is it solicited or unsolicited? Because unsolicited, well-meaning, even the most perfectly constructed piece of whatever that you're offering to a friend, if it's unsolicited. So I think the very first question is, are you open to stuff, to words, to information, or do you just need me to be here with you in absolute silence? Which is totally fine. So let's assume we've solved for they're open to the feedback. Asking someone, how do you feel is tricky because most people don't know legitimately when I'm in crisis and you're like, how do you feel? I feel bad. Great. Ta-da, jazz hands. I feel like shit. Now what? A question I really like to ask is if I see someone going through a thing, what I'll say is, what's the question that you wish someone would ask you right now? Like if you ask someone who's grieving, like, what's a question that you really wish someone would ask you right now? Often the answer that you'll hear is, I wish someone would ask me to talk about the person I love. Because there's this belief that when someone's grieving, we don't want to speak the name. We don't want to bring it up. We don't want to traumatize them any further. But if you ask, like people grieving often, not always, want to be able to talk about it. And asking someone the question, what's a question that you wish someone would ask you right now, will also put them from the back of their brain, that reactivity, flooded emotional zone, into like that prefrontal front of your brain where you can actually think and access logic. It puts them in the front of their brain without you having to do a emotional regulation technique. And it also helps them feel more seen because most people don't get asked questions, period. But getting to choose what's the question that you wish someone would ask you right now allows them to ask for what they need without you knowing that you just tricked them into doing it.
Yeah, that just warms my fucking heart just to like hear that as like, it's such a nourishing question, to ask that. I love that.
Have you been asked that?
I don't think I've been asked that. Wow. I mean, like, what? Gosh.
Can I ask you that just for an experiment? Yeah. What's a question that you wish somebody would ask you?
I think my first response would be, what would support look like for you today?
Did you notice like all your physiology when you were answering that question? You breathed, you went, you looked up, like your body did a lot of things in just considering the question.
Yeah, it's a real like, it was like this way of like feeling witnessed for myself, but also the possibility of, I don't know, getting my needs met, but also, that special thing. What about you? If I were to ask you the question,
that question does it to everybody every time. It's a great little party hack, by the way. If you're stuck in a conversation, just ask someone that. I think I would be asked, like, what are you celebrating now? Because we're not supposed to be happy because everything is hard. And admittedly, there are a lot of hard things, and I'm not minimizing that.
Yeah.
And sometimes it felt like when I was going through my shit and I was a mess every which way, it was a lot easier to connect with people.
Yeah.
And when things started going well, my circle got a lot smaller because it's hard to find people to celebrate with because you don't want to make them feel bad and you don't want them to think that you're full of yourself, and it gets tricky. But so I do a lot of yay, go me in my head with me and all of my parts. But it's really nice to be asked that question.
Thank you for joining us on this journey through some of the most memorable moments from our recent episodes. I hope these highlights have sparked new insights and inspired you as much as they've inspired me. If you found value in these conversations, I'd love for you to share them with your fellow gently used humans. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an episode. And if you have a moment, please leave a review. It helps us reach more people who could benefit from these powerful discussions. Until next time, keep growing, keep healing, and keep being the wonderfully imperfect humans that you are.